I want to speak a little bit about Karpas. And Karpas is a very interesting part of the Seder, and interesting from two perspectives. Spend the first part of this year discussing halachically, specifically how much Karpas we have to eat, both because it's very practical about how much we have to eat, and also because it ties into the larger question of what is Karpas doing here. At the end, maybe we'll give one or two ideas about why we eat this vegetable. So the first source on your sheet is from the Talmud, Masechet Pesachim, and it's the Mishnah is written a little bit cryptically, but I'll read the English here. The brackets is not actually in the Mishnah, but it's the context the Mishnah is coming within. After the head of the household recited Kiddush over the first cup of wine, that's the context, right? We've drank in the first cup, Kiddush, or what we call in the Seder, Kadesh. They brought before him, the head of the Seder, everyone at the Seder, vegetables. For the Karpas ritual, he dips and eats lettuce before he reaches the course that is secondary to the matzah. Secondary to the matzah here being the maror. So before we get to the maror, which comes after the matzah, before we get to the matzah and the maror, we eat karpas. And the question is, how much karpas should we eat? So I think there's really two sides. For those who are familiar, much of this shir will be the laws of brachot, the laws of blessings. And for those who are familiar with the laws of blessings, a size that often comes up. Someone was joking with me before about the olives that we had at breakfast. So we all had olives today, so we see the size of an olive. What's called in halacha kazayit. The zayit means an olive. Kazayit, the size of an olive, is a halachic term. If you eat more than that, whether or not today, if the actual size of an olive might be a little bigger, but if you eat that amount, you're obligated in an after bracha, and if you don't, you're not. So when we say we have to eat karpas, how much do we have to eat? There's two sides, there's two options. Either we can say you have to eat less than a kazait, less than the amount of an olive, and that would mean a very, very insignificant amount that would not require an after bracha, or we say we have to eat more, and once we say we have to eat more, perhaps you can eat as much as you'd like. And you can eat if you're eating celery, for example, for karpas, and you can eat 10 stalks, whatever you're in the mood for. So, on one hand, it makes sense to say we have to eat more than an olive's amount, more than a kazayit. And that's just like we eat more than a kazayit of matzah, more than an olive's amount of maror. And that is that anything that's more than an olive's amount represents a significant amount of eating. That's why, on one hand, you have to say an after bracha for eating that much. And that would make sense, because if it's a mitzvah, if we assume matzah is obviously a mitzvah, it says in the Torah, to eat matzah, maror is a mitzvah. Maybe nowadays it's a different level of obligation because the Beit HaMikdash no longer stands. We no longer have an actual korban Pesach, a paschal lamb or a sacrifice. Still we eat maror, and we have to eat more than a kazai because there's a mitzvah to eat maror. So what is karpas? If we assume karpas is its own mitzvah, it would make sense to assume that you have to eat more than an olive's amount. So the Rambam writes in source 2, he begins and recites the blessing Borei Pri Adama, which is the blessing we recite on all vegetables, takes the vegetable, dips it in charoset. Interestingly, I don't think that's our practice. We often dip the karpas in salt water, but the Rambam writes that you dip it in charoset. Sounds a little more tasty than salt water. And he eats a kazayit. The Rambam writes that we do eat an olive's amount or more than an olive's amount of karpas. He and all those eating together with him, each and every one, do not eat less than a kazait, not less than an olive's amount. So it sounds like from a Rambam, from Maimonides, that the idea is karpas is its own mitzvah. It's really important that you eat more than an olive's amount because it's its own mitzvah, and you need to fulfill that mitzvah by eating a significant halachic amount. The other reason to suggest that we should eat more than an olive's amount is based on urchatz. You know that we wash our hands before karpas. Maybe another time we can discuss why exactly we do that, different approaches. But I don't think any of us have this practice. But there are rabbis, there are opinions that say one would recite a bracha on the Netilas Yadayim, just like we did today before we washed for our bagels. Some say you'd say on the Netilas Yadayim before you wash for karpas. That's not the common practice. However, for those who say you should, it would make sense to suggest that you should eat more than a kazait, more than an olive's amount of karpas, as you're saying a bracha on the washing. You're saying this is a significant action of eating, and therefore it would make sense to eat a significant amount of food. So that would be on one hand to suggest we eat more than a kazait. However, let's now talk about the other side of the coin, eating less than a kasai, less than an olive's amount of karpas. So the reason that would make sense, and as we mentioned before, if you just have a nibble, you just have a tiny bit of something, you always need a bracha rishona, you always need the blessing before you eat, and the key for karpas is that the bracha is going to be a borei pri adama, so it needs to be something that would actually get that bracha. There are some problematic foods, I'm happy to talk about after, maybe Rabbi Rothman will address this at another time, that people eat for karpas which aren't really a borei pri adama, so it's important to eat a borei pri adama. Some people have the minhag, I've heard of this, that there's also an idea that it should be green, because we're in the springtime now, at least we feel it today, I don't know if we'll feel it by the end of the week, but that it should be green. However, some have the practice, Pesach is a night of questions, so I've heard that some of the practice of eating a banana for karpas, or pineapple for karpas, just to teach people that those are actually a borei pri hadama, despite the fact they grow from a tree. It's based on the fact that the tree falls down every year and is not and has to regrow. But those two foods are exceptions, and we want to Pesach is a night of teaching. So some people eat those for karpas to teach that those are really borei pri hadama, something that's not so well known. So you have to eat a borei pri hadama. And the question is maror. As we said, the Mishnah kind of linked. The Mishnah said that we eat it before it's secondary to the matzah, i.e. maror. And maror comes much later in the Seder. But when you read the Gemara, I brought it on the sheet here, I did not. The Gemara says that when we eat maror, we say the bracha for maror, al achila maror, on eating the maror, just like we say al achila matzah, eating the matzah. But we know when we eat matzah, we say two blessings. We say al achilas matzah, and we also say hamotzi lacha min haaretz, just like we say when we have the bagel or any sort of bread any day. However, when we eat maror, the Gemara makes no mention of saying a borei pri hadama on the maror. And that could be for one of two reasons. When does maror come in the Seder? It comes after the matzah. Right? So you already said a hamotzi. So the simple reason not to say a bracha on maror is because you're in the middle of a meal. I assume last night, 2 nights ago, Friday night, we sat down, we said Kiddush, we took our chalos, we said hamotzi, and then probably many of us had chicken soup. I'm sure no one here said a shahakol on their chicken soup. If you eat chicken soup on a Tuesday afternoon, we say a shahakol ni'abivara, a blessing on the chicken soup. When we ate it Friday night in the course of a meal, we did not say our own bracha. If you had a salad Friday night, no one said a bracha on the salad. Or the chicken. They're part of the meal. They go with the bread. Some foods, like cream cheese, egg salad, actually you spread on the bread, and therefore they would be exempted with the bracha of hamotzi. And other foods are considered part of a meal. A soup, a salad, those are part of the meal. So maror, one could suggest, is part of the meal. It's both is part of the meal. Maybe some people eat celery, some people eat lettuce. Those are banana. Those are perhaps meal type foods. So maybe that's why the maror does not need its own bracha. Or perhaps because halachically we're obligated to eat maror. It's in the seder. So because you have to eat it, therefore you could say it's part of it, so it doesn't need its own bracha. On the other hand, we could suggest no. For example, this is also a separate conversation, but many would suggest that for dessert, let's say you have ice cream for dessert, even though you already said hamotzi, many would say you say a shahakal on the ice cream because ice cream is not really part of the meal. If you go to a restaurant and you order a soup, it might come with bread. You order a salad, it might come with bread. You order ice cream, it doesn't come with bread. Even though no one puts the salad on the bread, they go together. Salad and bread, soup and bread. Ice cream doesn't go with bread. So it's not really part of the meal. We just happen to eat it. So then it would still need its own bracha. So perhaps we can say the same thing about maror. Despite the fact that maror might be celery, and you could say celery goes in a salad and salad is part of the meal, the celery doesn't really go with bread, both like in the way we eat it. People eat celery as a snack, but it's not like something that goes on bread. And also, once again, maybe the same argument of halacha can be flipped, that maror is not really part of the meal. If we were sitting down for a meal, we would have the chicken soup and the chicken and the salad. No one would eat maror. So maror maybe it's halachically imposed upon the meal, and therefore it's not really part of the meal, and the hamotzi that we say on the matzah has nothing to do with the maror, so perhaps then the maror needs its own bracha. So that's the story of the bracha of maror. So the Gemara seems to say we do not say a borei pri hadama, but it doesn't say we don't, it just leaves it out. It says you only say al achila maror. So we're not really sure. Does maror need a bracha? Does maror not need a bracha of borei pri hadama for the eating of it, besides the bracha because it's its own mitzvah? So one way to solve this problem would be to say a borei pri hadama on something else. That something else could be the karpas. we have the karpas much earlier. And so, if we ate more than a kazait, more than an olive's amount of karpas, perhaps we could suggest, oh, well, the maror is very far away, and they're unconnected, it's much too far apart, so we can't say, we will say that brei pri adama on the karpas has nothing to do with the brei pri, with the maror, and therefore, if you ate more than an olive's amount, you need a separate after bracha, because otherwise it's not connected. However, on the other hand, we could suggest that maybe we do need that brei pri adama to carry all the way from the karpas to the maror. So it seems like the best solution is to eat less than a kazayit, just to take a tiny nibble of karpas, and therefore you're not obligated in an after bracha at all. So if it's too long, this is very Talmudic thinking, if it's too long, if the time period is much too long for the after bracha, fine. You were never obligated in after bracha, you didn't make a mistake by not making one. And if it's not too long, which some of the commentators suggest, even though the time, the amount of minutes, depends how fast you have your Seder, but most of us probably take an hour between karpas and maror, so that's probably too long. If I sat down for a bite of celery now, in an hour I want another bite on a Sunday morning, today, I would probably say 2 different brei pri adamas. But some commentators suggest that because you're in the Seder, the Haggadah itself is a connection, despite the time lapse. So the Haggadah connects the two sides, so therefore, we can suggest that the bracha does stretch. So to avoid, it seems, to let it stretch, you don't want to say an after bracha. If you say an after bracha, you cut it off. So therefore, if you eat less than a kazayit, we can suggest that therefore we're not going to get it. We'll save ourselves on both sides. If it's too long, we didn't need an after bracha, so we didn't eat without saying an after bracha, which is not a good thing to do. And if it's not too long, then we covered the maror with the brei pri adama on the karpas. But perhaps the maror, and if it is too long, what about the maror? So you can maybe suggest that the maror is part of the meal, because there's two sides to the maror question as well. So I skipped some sources here. However, you'll see in source 3, the Shulchan Aruch, we'll skip right to source 4, because the time is late, and the Shulchan Aruch tells us what we should do. Wash your hands in order to dip the first time, i.e. karpas, but do not say a blessing on this washing. Why don't we say a blessing on this washing? Different reasons, but perhaps one of them is because we're not sure how much of the karpas we should eat, and we're going to end up eating, as we'll see in the end of the Shulchan Aruch, a small amount. Take from the karpas less than the size of an olive, less than a kazayit. So the Shulchan Aruch does not follow Maimonides. He disagrees with Rambam, and he says to eat less than a kazayit, and dip it in vinegar. Interestingly, he says vinegar. I think most of our practice is salt water. And say the blessing of brei pri adama and eat, and do not say a blessing afterwards. Specifically, do not say a blessing afterwards. 1, because you're not obligated, because you ate such a small amount, and 2, so that the bracha might carry all the way to the maror. So I think that's the common practice, and you'll see in many Haggadahs, it'll tell you to eat the karpas and don't eat a big amount, which is very hard at points because some people are very hungry, and it's the only thing you get to eat for the next hour or so. But it seems like the best halakhic practice is to refrain and not eat too much of your banana or celery or whatever else you have for karpas, and just eat a tiny bit in order to fulfill the idea of karpas. According to this approach, it would seem also that karpas is not necessarily its own mitzvah per se. It seems that's what the Shulchan Aruch is telling us, that karpas is important, but it's not a mitzvah, because if it was a mitzvah, we'd have to say you'd have to eat a significant amount, as you do matzah and maror, so karpas would seem to be on a lower level and less important. So that's the main point of what I wanted to speak about, but just in the last few minutes, before we bench. So now that we're eating this karpas, so why are we eating it? Why are we doing this? So I guess one approach could be what we just spoke about. Perhaps we're eating it simply for the bracha. To get a bracha that is then going to go on the maror. The maror we don't need it. We don't know if we need its own brei pri adama. And this way we have another food that we can get a bracha. We can get the bracha that maybe we'll carry. The other approach we can suggest is perhaps we'll suggest basically three approaches. One is maybe it's just an appetizer. I think that works. An appetizer that we have at many meals to whet our appetites and get us ready for the Seder. More 2 other approaches. In source 5, the Rashbam says a very interesting approach. It's slightly unsatisfying at the end, but I think it teaches us a lesson at Pesach that many of us may be familiar with. He says, before he reaches the course that is secondary to the matzah, that's referring to the maror, he's a commentary here on the Gemara, just quotes that line, the italicized line is a quote of the Gemara. before reaching the vegetable that is eaten after matzah, on which you recite al achilat maror, as is written, with matzah and maror they shall eat it. That's a long way of saying before maror. First matzah and only afterwards maror. And here in the bold, the purpose of this first dipping, i.e. the purpose of karpas, was that the children will recognize your action and ask you about it. For humans don't normally eat vegetables before the meal. For us, we probably live in a little bit different time. The Rashbam here, you can see here, lived between 1080 and 1160, so about 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, excuse me. So 1,000 years ago, maybe they weren't so into salad as we are today, but still, it's still unusual for us, either because we eat it before hamotzi, if we're eating a bread meal, mostly we wash and then have the salad, or because we're dipping it, and as we say in the Manishtana, what's with all this dipping? We dip now and we dip later. So something's weird here, and he says it's to get the children to start asking. Now the obvious problem with that is, so you do this weird thing, your child has just reached the age where they understand what's going on, and you have someone new at your table, and you have this whole karpas ritual, and they say, so why are you doing this? And you say, exactly, and they just move on. That doesn't work out. So there's got to be something more here. I'm still searching to understand exactly what to make of this. I don't have a great answer to that question, but it seems from the Rashbam that it's more the idea. We know that the Seder is a night of questioning, a night of the Manishtana, a night of getting the children involved, many of the practice of doing all sorts of things to keep the kids involved, whether it's with the makos, throwing toy frogs at them, or many Svardim, and I've seen Ashkenazim adopt this practice as well, throw like matzah over their shoulder and start walking around the table, things to make it more lively and get everyone involved. So the Rashbam was saying perhaps the karpas is another one of these tools, another way to get people involved in the process and engage them that way. And the other, just quickly, I didn't write this on the sheet, I apologize, it's actually a very visual thing. For those who can picture the word karpas in their mind or find it on the sheet, if you look at the Beis Yosef brings down an opinion that karpas backwards is actually samech, the letter samech, and parach, which means samech in gematria, in Hebrew, every letter corresponds to a number. Samech is literally 60, but they assume that, it's a little bit of a jump, but they assume that 60 can be 600,000. And that 600,000 parach, meaning back-breaking labor. That we know, the Torah teaches us 600,000 men left Egypt, probably 2 million or so Jews in total, but that 600,000 men suffered back-breaking labor. So perhaps this is a completely different perspective on karpas. It almost equates it to maror, which is fairly interesting because the example the Gemara gives of karpas is lettuce. It doesn't necessarily give it as the best example. We know that lettuce is really the ideal form of maror, and the Gemara talks about the karpas that you definitely could use lettuce. Obviously, lettuce is a borei pri adama. It comes from the ground. It's a vegetable. Seems like it's better to use a non-maror, something that isn't the same as maror, but you could. And so, perhaps in this perspective that the Beis Yosef quotes, maybe karpas is once again we're in the beginning of the Seder. The idea of the Seder is that we go talking about from Gnus to Shevach, that we start the Seder talking about the pain we were in, the slavery we were a part of, and we continue along the process of the Haggadah, getting towards the Shevach, praising God for the redemption that we did face, the redemption that we succeeded, that God gave us. And so through the course of the Seder, we move there, and maybe since Karpas is all the way at the beginning, according to this approach, the word backwards is hinting at the 600,000 men who suffered back-breaking labor while they were in Egypt. And as they continued on, as we continue through the Seder, we tell the story of how, thank God, we got out of that, and we experienced freedom. At the bottom of the sheet, we don't have time for it now, I quoted to you Rav Kook. Rav Kook is a rather mystical approach on Karpas, which maybe we could leave for another day.